My mother-in-law was not a woman who said things plainly. In 31 years of marriage, I could count on one hand the times Ruth had looked me in the eye and said exactly what she meant. Woman. She was a woman of suggestion, of implication, of long silences that could mean anything or nothing depending on the day. I used to think that was just how she was built, cautious, Midwestern, raised in a house where feelings were tucked away like good china, brought out only for funerals. I understand her differently now. There are 16 small frames hanging in my memory, even though they've been packed away in boxes for over a year. 16 cross-stitched pieces, each one Ruth made with her own hands, each one given to me at Christmas for 16 consecutive years. They hung all over my house for most of my adult life, in the hallway, above the kitchen sink, in the spare bedroom where I read in the evenings. I dusted them. I straightened them after the grandchildren bumped the walls. I pointed them out to guests who complimented the needlework. I never once removed them from their frames. That was my mistake. Or maybe it was exactly what Ruth counted on. I need to go back a little, because none of this makes sense without knowing who Ruth was and who Dennis was, and what kind of marriage I walked into without fully understanding what I was walking into. I met Dennis at a church potluck in the autumn of 1989. I was 32 years old, recently divorced from a man I'd rather not name, working as a librarian at the middle school 2 towns over. Dennis was tall and well-spoken, and he had a way of making you feel like the most interesting person in the room. He asked about my work before he told me about his, which I thought was a sign of good character. He called when he said he would call. He opened car doors. He remembered I mentioned that I liked yellow tulips, and on our 4th date, he brought me a bunch of them, wrapped in brown paper. I thought I had found something rare. We married in April of 1991. Ruth was 62 years old at the time, already widowed, and she stood in the front pew of the church wearing pale blue and dabbing at her eyes in a way that I found touching. After the ceremony, she hugged me for a long time and said, close to my ear, "Take care of yourself, Margaret." I thought it was a sweet, motherly thing to say. I wrote it off as nerves, as emotion, as the sentiment of a woman watching her only son get married. I've thought about those 4 words 1,000 times since last March. The early years were good, or at least I believed they were. Dennis worked in commercial real estate, and for a long time, there was plenty of money. We bought a house in Fairview. We took vacations to Florida in February. We talked about retirement like it was something we were building together, brick by brick, year by year. I kept teaching. I kept my own checking account because it was what I'd always done. What my mother had told me never to give up, and Dennis never pushed back on that, which I also took as a sign of good character. Ruth came for Thanksgiving and Easter and most Christmases. She was polite to me in the way that a careful woman is polite, never unkind, never intrusive, but never quite warm either. She called me Margaret, never Maggie, even though everyone else in my life used Maggie. She brought casseroles I could never quite replicate, no matter how many times she explained the recipe. She gave Dennis long, searching looks when she thought I wasn't watching. The cross-stitch frames started in 1993. I had admired a small piece she'd made for a neighbor, a simple design of a lighthouse with a short verse beneath it, and I mentioned that it was lovely. The following Christmas, she handed me a flat, wrapped package. Inside was a wooden frame, maybe 8 inches by 10, and behind the glass was a piece of cream linen she had stitched herself. The verse read, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding." Proverbs 3-5. I hung it in the hallway near the front door. I thought it was beautiful. Every Christmas after that, there was another one. They were always quotes or scripture, always rendered in Ruth's careful, even stitches, always framed in simple, dark wood. Some years the quotes were religious. Some years they were more general things, like A gentle answer turns away wrath, or what is done in love is done well. One year she gave me a verse I didn't recognize. The prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it. I looked it up later. Proverbs 22:3. I remember thinking it was an odd choice, a little bleak for a Christmas gift, but Ruth had her own way of seeing things and I didn't question it. I should have questioned it. I should have turned the frame over. Dennis's business started changing somewhere around 2008 or 2009. The recession, he said. Everyone in commercial real estate was hurting. I understood that. I didn't ask too many questions because Dennis managed our finances and had always managed our finances. And in 30 years of marriage, I had never felt a reason to dig deeper. Our household account was always funded. The credit cards were always paid. He told me what I needed to know, and I told myself that was enough. But things were different. He was quieter at dinner. He took phone calls in his car and stayed out there long after I expected him inside. He started making trips to see clients that seemed to last longer than they should have. Once, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket for a hotel in Columbus. 2 nights, $340, and when I asked about it, he said it was a client meeting, and I believed him because I had been believing him for 20 years. And it is very hard to stop believing someone you have built a life with. Ruth visited less in those years. When she did come, she watched Dennis in that careful way of hers, and she watched me, and sometimes I caught her looking at the frames on my walls with an expression I couldn't read. Once, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, she said, "Margaret, do you ever think about what you do on your own?" And I laughed and said I hoped I'd never have to find out. And she looked at her tea and said nothing more. I didn't understand what she was asking. She passed away in October of 2022. She was 93 years old and she died in her own bed in the house where she had lived for 60 years, which was what she had wanted. Dennis and I drove down for the last week, and I held her hand on the afternoon of the 3rd day, and she looked at me for a long time without speaking, and I thought she was simply past words, past everything, already halfway somewhere else. But her eyes were clear. She was still in there. She was trying to tell me something and I didn't know how to hear it. We buried her on a Thursday. The reception afterward was at her neighbor Paulette's house, and people ate and told stories and laughed about Ruth's stubbornness and her cooking and the way she'd once argued with a contractor for 6 months over a downspout and won. I stood by the window with a plate of food I wasn't eating, and I missed her in a way that surprised me, because I had never thought of us as close, and yet something had shifted. Something was different now, and I couldn't name it. On the drive home, Dennis said, "We should think about clearing out those frames." I looked at him. "What frames?" "The ones she made, the cross stitches." He kept his eyes on the road. "They're a little dated. The house could use updating." I didn't answer right away. 16 frames, 16 Christmas mornings, 16 years of Ruth's careful hands and careful silence. "Not yet," I said. He didn't press it, but over the following months he mentioned it again. Twice, 3 times, always casual, always reasonable sounding. The house could use a refresh. The frames were old-fashioned. He'd seen some prints online that would look nice in the hallway. Each time I said not yet, and each time he let it drop, but the asking itself began to bother me in a way I couldn't articulate. Why did it matter to him? Ruth was gone. The frames weren't hurting anyone. I left them up. It wasn't until last March that everything changed. I was doing a deep clean of the spare bedroom. The kind I do every spring when the light shifts, and I suddenly see all the dust I've been ignoring since November. I pulled the small cross-stitch frame off the wall above the desk, the one with "the heart of her husband" trusts in her from Proverbs, and I noticed for the first time that the backing had come loose at one corner, just a little, just enough that a triangle of cardboard was peeling away from the frame. I set it on the desk and pressed the corner back down, and that's when I saw it. Writing, not printed, not stamped. penciled, in Ruth's handwriting, small and slanted, the way old women write when they've been writing the same way for 80 years and their hands have learned the shape of the letters by heart. My breath stopped. I turned the frame over completely and laid it face down on the desk, and I looked at what was written on the cardboard backing. And I read it once, and then I read it again, and my hands were shaking by the time I finished. Margaret. Dennis borrowed $40,000 from his father's estate before I could settle it. He told me it was for the business. He has not paid it back. He does not intend to. I cannot say this to your face. I am sorry. $40,000. I sat down on the edge of the bed. The room was very quiet. Outside, I could hear a car passing on the street, and somewhere down the block, a dog was barking, and my whole ordinary afternoon had just cracked open. I got up, and I went to the hallway, and I took down the frame by the front door. The one from 1993, the very first one she had ever given me. I turned it over. I pried the backing loose with my thumbnail. More penciled writing, cramped and careful. He refinanced the house in 2007 without telling you. I found the paperwork by accident when I visited. He said not to mention it. I have worried about this every day since. The room tilted. I went to the kitchen. I took down the frame above the sink. My fingers weren't steady. I broke a nail prying the backing off, and I didn't notice until later. Dennis owes money to two men I don't know. They called the house looking for him in 2011. He told me they were clients. I don't believe he was telling the truth. Please be careful. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I don't know how long I sat there. The afternoon light moved across the tile while I held 3 small pieces of cardboard and tried to understand what I was holding. Ruth had known. Ruth had known for years, decades, maybe, and she could not say it. Could not look at her son and accuse him. Could not walk into my kitchen and sit across from me and say, "Margaret, your husband is not the man you think he is." She was his mother. He was her child. There are things a mother cannot bring herself to do, no matter what she knows, and so she had done the only thing she could think of. She had stitched her warnings into linen. She had written them where only I would find them if I ever thought to look. She had given me 16 chances in 16 years, and I had hung every one of them on my walls and never once turned them over. I should have been angry at her for that. Part of me was. But sitting on my kitchen floor in the late afternoon light, holding 3 small pieces of cardboard with her handwriting on them, I was mostly just stunned by the shape of her love, how enormous it was, and how silent, and how long she had carried it. I went through the rest of the house methodically. I took every frame off every wall. I laid them face down on the dining room table, and I opened them one by one, and I read what was written on each backing in Ruth's careful pencil, and by the time I was finished, the table was covered, and I had been crying for an hour without noticing. There were 16 notes in 16 frames. Not every one of them was about money, though most of them were. Some were about smaller things, a lie Dennis had told her years before we met, a pattern she had noticed in how he spoke about women, a time she had seen him take cash from her purse and say nothing about it. One note, from the frame she'd given me in 2005, the one with, "What is done in love is done well," said only, "He is not careful with what belongs to other people. He never has been. I am sorry I did not tell you sooner." And one note, from the frame she'd given me in 2014, the Proverbs verse about the prudent person hiding from danger said, "If you ever need to protect yourself, the account number below is an account I opened in your name only. The bank is First Federal in Millbrook. I have been putting money in it for 8 years. It is yours." He does not know about it. There was an account number. There was a PIN. I read it 3 times. She had opened a savings account in my name, without my knowledge. Without my asking. She had been putting money into it for 8 years because she was a 93-year-old woman who knew her time was running out and she needed to know that I would be all right. I called the bank the next morning. The account was real. The balance was enough to matter. I did not tell Dennis that day. I did not tell him the next day either. I put the frames back on their hangers and I went about my life, and I watched my husband move through our house with a quieter eye than I had ever used before. I started paying attention to things I had been too trusting to pay attention to for 30 years. I pulled our credit report. I called a financial advisor. My friend Linda had recommended. I made an appointment with an attorney whose name was not Chen. What I found over the following weeks I will not recount in detail, because it is still being sorted out, and because some of it is still too raw. But Ruth was right. She had been right about all of it, and she had known she was right, and she had loved me enough to build me a ladder before the floor gave out. I thought about her a great deal during those weeks. I thought about the afternoon of her last day, when she had looked at me with those clear eyes and I had thought she was past words. I think now that she was saying something. I think she was saying. I thought about the way she had hugged me at my wedding and said, close to my ear, "Take care of yourself, Margaret." She wasn't just being sentimental. She was telling me the most important thing she knew. She had been watching her son for 60-some years, and she knew exactly what kind of man he was. And she was trying, in the only way available to her in that moment in the church doorway with rice still in her hair, to warn me. I didn't know how to listen then. I know how to listen now. I moved out of the house in June. I took the cross-stitch frames with me. They are in a box in the apartment I am renting now. A small, bright place with big windows and a porch where I have put flower boxes and a chair I like to sit in on Sunday mornings with coffee. I have thought about hanging the frames again. I go back and forth on it. There is something painful about them and something precious about them, and I haven't decided yet how to hold both of those things at once. But I have thought about what Ruth was doing in the end. I have thought about it a lot. She was a woman who could not fight her son directly and could not leave me unprotected, and so she had threaded a needle and bent her head over a piece of linen and stitched something beautiful on the front and something true on the back, and handed it to me year after year and hoped that someday I would be curious enough or desperate enough or simply present enough to turn it over. She was not a perfect woman. She kept silent for too long. She let me walk into things I might have avoided. There are nights when I am less charitable about it, when I lie awake thinking about what my life might have looked like if I had known at 40 what I know at 63. Those nights are hard. But then I think about an old woman sitting alone in her house in the evenings after Dennis and I had driven home, getting out her embroidery hoop and her pencil, thinking carefully about what to say, choosing her words the way she had chosen her threads, with patience, with precision, with the knowledge that they needed to last, writing them in a hand that was getting less steady every year, on the back of a frame she had made with love, folding the backing back down, wrapping it in tissue paper, doing it again the following Christmas. And the one after that, 16 years of trying to reach me. She reached me. It just took time. There is a woman I know from my library days. She called me a few weeks after I moved out, because word travels in small towns. And she asked how I was doing, and I told her, more honestly than I usually tell people, that I was shaky but standing. She said something I have been thinking about ever since. She said, "The people who love us leave us what they can. It's not always what we need right away. Sometimes it's what we need later." I think Ruth understood that. I think she made her peace with planting things she might not live to see bloom. She was 93 years old, and she had been waiting a long time, and she had done what she could do, and she had trusted me to find the rest. I found it. I am still finding it, honestly. Some mornings I wake up, and the weight of the last year sits heavy, and I don't move for a while, and I just breathe, and remind myself that I have a porch with flower boxes and a chair I like, and a bank account that has my name on it, and nobody else's. Some mornings that is enough. Some mornings it is more than enough. I talked to a woman last month who reminded me of myself, 20 years ago, younger, but the same look around the eyes, the particular tiredness of a person who has been paying attention to everything except the thing they most need to see. We only talked for a few minutes. I didn't know enough about her situation to say anything useful, but I told her what Ruth told me at a church door in April of 1991, and I said it as plainly as I could, which is how I wish Ruth had been able to say it. Take care of yourself, not as a pleasantry, not as filler between the real things, as the whole message, as the most important thing. I am 63 years old, and I am living alone for the first time in my adult life. And some days that feels like loss, and some days it feels like something else entirely. Something I don't have a clean word for yet. Not peace, exactly. Something in between, something with more texture than either of those words. The feeling of a person who has been carrying a weight for so long that she forgot she was carrying it. And then one afternoon, in a spare bedroom in March, she set it down, and now she is just learning what it feels like to stand up straight. The flower boxes on my porch have yellow tulips in them. I planted them myself.